Good evening and welcome back. Tonight's story takes us back more than 500 years to a quiet, candlelit world of kings, queens, and long, echoing palace halls. A world where time moved slowly, gently, peacefully. At the center of that world lived King Henry VIII, remembered for his power, his decisions, and most of all, his 6 wives. But tonight, we tell this history softly, calmly, like turning the pages of a worn storybook as you drift toward sleep. So get comfortable, breathe slowly, and allow the gentle rhythm of Tudor England to guide you into rest. Our story begins. Before the tyrant, before the 6 wives, before the break with Rome that would forever change the course of history, there was just a young man, a prince, who never expected to be king. Welcome back to our series on the Tudors. Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth and legend to find the real Henry VIII, starting with his unexpected rise to power. Born in 1491, Henry was the 2nd son of Henry VII. His older brother, Arthur, was the heir apparent, the Prince of Wales. From birth, Arthur was groomed to rule. He was educated, trained in statecraft, and betrothed to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, to forge a powerful alliance. Young Henry, the Spare, was destined for a different path, most likely a life in the church. Can you imagine Henry VIII as the Archbishop of Canterbury? History would have been vastly different. He received a first-class Renaissance education. He was fluent in Latin and French, had a working knowledge of Italian and Spanish, and was a gifted musician and composer. He played the lute, the organ, and the virginals. Some of his compositions, like Pastime with Good Company, are still performed today. He was also a passionate theologian, a fact that becomes incredibly ironic later in his life. Beyond his intellect, Henry was a celebrated athlete. He excelled at jousting, hunting, and real tennis, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful build and a shock of red gold hair. He was the very picture of a storybook prince. He was handsome, charismatic, and by all accounts, utterly charming. But in 1502, everything changed. At just 15 years old, Prince Arthur, recently married to Catherine, fell ill and died suddenly. The Tudor succession, so carefully planned by Henry VII, was thrown into chaos. Suddenly, the 10-year-old Spare was the heir to the English throne. The weight of the dynasty now rested on his young shoulders. Henry VII, a famously cautious and calculating king, kept his new heir on a tight leash. Young Henry was largely kept out of the public eye and away from the business of government. His father, perhaps fearing another loss, was intensely protective. For 7 long years, Henry waited in the wings, studying and training, but rarely tasting real power. This period of waiting must have been incredibly frustrating for a young man so full of energy and ambition. Then, in 109, Henry VII died. At the age of just 17, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VIII. The nation rejoiced. After the grim, austere reign of his father, the accession of this vibrant, handsome young king felt like the dawn of a new golden age. He was England's great hope, a Renaissance prince ready to lead his country into a glorious future. One of his first acts as king was to address the issue of his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. She had been living in a state of diplomatic limbo in England since Arthur's death. A marriage to Henry would secure the valuable Spanish alliance. But there was a problem. Church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. A special papal dispensation was required, based on the claim that Catherine and Arthur's marriage had never been consummated. After much debate, the Pope granted it, and so, in June 1, S09, just weeks after his coronation, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon. At the time, it seemed like a fairy tale romance. He was a chivalrous young king, rescuing a noble princess. She was pious, intelligent, and deeply in love with her new husband. For the first 2 decades of their marriage, they were, by all accounts, a devoted couple. Henry trusted her implicitly, even making her regent of the kingdom while he was away on campaign in France. The early years of his reign were a whirlwind of celebration and spectacle. The court of Henry VIII was a dazzling center of European culture. There were lavish banquets, extravagant masques, and thrilling tournaments where the king himself would often compete, always to the roar of an adoring crowd. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, attracting scholars like Thomas More and Erasmus to his circle. He invested in the navy, building magnificent warships like the Mary Rose. This was the Camelot of the Tudors, and Henry was its King Arthur. He was generous, affable, and full of life. It's in this period we see him sitting in the halls of his palaces, not as a brooding tyrant, but as a young king, educated, musical, athletic, and full of energy, yet still possessed of a youthful calm. He was the embodiment of hope and promise. But beneath the glittering surface, the pressures were mounting. The primary duty of any king was to secure the succession with a male heir. Catherine of Aragon, despite multiple pregnancies, had a series of heartbreaking miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived past infancy. As the years ticked by without a son, a shadow began to fall over the once happy marriage and the bright promise of the reign. The king's charm could curdle into impatience, his confidence into arrogance. The lack of a male heir wasn't just a personal disappointment. In a world where a female ruler was almost unthinkable, it was a direct threat to the stability of the Tudor dynasty his father had fought so hard to establish. This anxiety over the succession would become the defining obsession of Henry's life. It would drive him to question his marriage, his faith, and the very foundations of his kingdom. The golden prince of his youth would begin to transform, slowly but surely, into the ruthless, paranoid monarch we remember today. The path from the hopeful young king to the man who would execute his wives and ministers began right here in the quiet desperation for a son. The innocence was fading, and the chaos was just beginning. Imagine Hampton Court, not as a stage for intrigue and betrayal, but as a home. Picture Catherine, a woman of deep intelligence and grace, sitting by a window. Soft sunlight streams in, illuminating the room with a warm, golden glow. Outside in the courtyard, the gentle chirping of birds provides a peaceful soundtrack. This was the backdrop for much of her life with Henry. For over 2 decades, their marriage was defined by a quiet stability, a rhythm of shared daily routines. They took their meals together, presided over the court's elaborate ceremonies side by side, and spent countless quiet evenings in each other's company. This was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared duty. Catherine wasn't just a wife. She was a queen, consort in every sense of the word, a trusted advisor, and even a capable regent who governed England while Henry was away at war. The people of England adored her for her piety, her charity, and her unwavering dignity. She was their queen, a symbol of Spanish strength and Catholic virtue. Their bond was forged in the early, optimistic years of Henry's reign. a time filled with masks, jousts, and the promise of a glorious future. Henry, young and athletic, was the very picture of a Renaissance prince, and Catherine was his perfect queen. He wrote songs for her, jousted in her honor, and referred to her as his beloved wife. This period of their marriage stands in stark contrast to the turbulence that would later define Henry's life. It was, without a doubt, the calmest and most conventional chapter of his 6 marriages. For 24 years, they were a united front, the king and queen of a prosperous and hopeful England. Catherine provided Henry with a sense of order and continuity. Her calm demeanor was a steadying influence on his more impulsive nature. In her, he had not just a spouse, but a political partner who understood the delicate dance of European diplomacy. Her lineage as the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the legendary Catholic monarchs of Spain, gave Henry's fledgling dynasty an immense sense of legitimacy on the world stage. Of course, we know this tranquility wasn't destined to last. The pressure to produce a male heir was a dark cloud that hung over their marriage from the very beginning. Catherine endured multiple heart-wrenching pregnancies that ended in stillbirths, miscarriages, or infant deaths. Their only surviving child was a daughter, the future Mary I will beloved. A daughter was not the son Henry believed he needed to secure the Tudor line. This single persistent issue would slowly begin to poison the well of their relationship. Henry's affection, once so clear and public, began to waver. His desire for a son grew into an obsession, one that would eventually lead him to question the very validity of their union. He started to look back at the biblical texts, specifically a passage in Leviticus that forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow. Catherine had, of course, been briefly married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before his untimely death. At the time, a papal dispensation had been secured to allow her to marry Henry, but now, years later, the king began to see it as a curse. He convinced himself that their lack of male heirs was a sign of God's displeasure. This religious anxiety, combined with his burgeoning passion for a charismatic young lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn, created the perfect storm. The calm, routine-filled days at Hampton Court were numbered. The quiet evenings of shared companionship gave way to tense arguments and stony silences. The queen, who had been his trusted partner for over 2 decades, suddenly found herself cast as the obstacle to his desires and the nation's future. The stability she had so carefully cultivated was about to be shattered. The long, unhurried marriage was hurtling towards a dramatic and unprecedented end. An end that would not only break a queen's heart, but also break England from the Catholic Church, forever changing the course of history. What happened next is a story of defiance, faith, and heartbreak. Catherine's refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage and her insistence on her status as Henry's true wife and queen is a testament to her incredible strength of character. She fought not just for herself, but for her daughter's legitimacy and for the faith she held so dear. The serene image of Catherine reading by the window becomes all the more poignant when we know the turmoil that was to come. It was the calm before the storm, the final, fleeting moments of peace in a life that would end in exile and isolation, but never in defeat. Her legacy as a dignified, loyal, and resolute queen endures to this day. In the grand, gilded court of King Henry VIII, that person was Anne Boleyn. Imagine the English court in the early 1520s. It's a world of whispers, alliances, and rigid tradition. King Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon, a devout and respected queen. For years, their union has been the bedrock of the Tudor dynasty. But it's a bedrock with a fatal crack. They have no male heir, only a daughter, Mary. In an age where a king's strength was measured by his ability to produce a son, this was more than a personal disappointment. It was a political crisis waiting to happen. The Tudor hold on the throne was still relatively new, and the memory of the bloody Wars of the Roses was fresh. Without a clear male successor, the future of England was uncertain. Henry, a man of immense ego and deep-seated faith, grew increasingly desperate. He saw the lack of a son as a divine judgment, a punishment for marrying his brother's widow, something the Bible seemed to forbid. This anxiety gnawed at him, casting a long shadow over his marriage and his reign. The court was a place of tense waiting, everyone aware of the king's growing obsession. And into this charged atmosphere, a new face appeared. A young woman recently returned from the glittering courts of France. She was not a princess, not a high-ranking noble, but a lady-in-waiting. Her name was Anne Boleyn. When Anne arrived, she wasn't like the other English ladies. Having spent her formative years in the sophisticated and intellectually vibrant French court, she was different. She was stylish, her fashion choices reflecting the latest continental trends. She was an accomplished musician and a captivating dancer, but her allure went far beyond her appearance. Anne was fiercely intelligent, with a quick, sharp wit that could disarm courtiers and, as it turned out, enchant a king. She wasn't just beautiful, she was fascinating. She could debate theology, discuss politics, and trade clever remarks with the most educated men at court. In a world where women were expected to be demure and passive, Anne was a force of nature, bold, confident, and utterly unapologetic. It wasn't love at first sight, not in the fairy tale sense. Henry was, at first, simply intrigued. He was a man who appreciated wit and spirit, and Anne had both in abundance. She wasn't just another pretty face in the crowd. She stood out. She challenged him. When he spoke, she listened intently, but she also spoke back, offering her own opinions, her own insights. This was new. It was exciting. For a king used to sycophants and agreeable courtiers, Anne's spirited independence was like a breath of fresh air. Their initial interactions were part of the game of courtly love, a popular tradition at the time. It was a flirtatious, stylized ritual of poems, gifts, and longing glances, all governed by a set of unspoken rules. Henry, a master of the game, began to pursue Anne, but Anne played the game differently. Other women might have been flattered into becoming the king's mistress, a position that offered luxury but little real power or security. But Anne refused. She wasn't interested in being a temporary amusement. She had seen what happened to mistresses, including her own sister, Mary Boleyn, who had a brief affair with the king and was then cast aside. Anne wanted more. She wanted respect. She wanted a crown. By refusing to become his mistress, she flipped the script entirely. She wasn't a prize to be won and then forgotten. She was an equal in this dangerous game of desire and power. This refusal, this audacious act of defiance, only inflamed Henry's obsession. It was a challenge he couldn't resist. The more she said no, the more he wanted her. He had conquered armies and bent the will of powerful men, yet he couldn't conquer the will of this one woman. His letters to her, which miraculously survive to this day, reveal a king completely bewitched. He writes not as a monarch commanding a subject, but as a desperate lover, pleading for any sign of her affection. He calls her his one and only, promising to make her his queen. This promise was the spark that would set a kingdom ablaze. To marry Anne, Henry had to first unmarry Catherine of Aragon. This was no simple task. Catherine was a Spanish princess, the aunt of the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. More importantly, the Catholic Church did not permit divorce. Marriage was a sacrament for life, and so began what history calls the King's Great Matter. Henry's quest for an annulment from the Pope became the single driving obsession of his reign. He argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid from the start, cursed by God. He sent envoys to Rome, bribed cardinals, and scoured ancient texts for theological loopholes. For 7 long years, the political and religious battle raged. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, refused to grant the annulment. Throughout this long and agonizing period, Anne was at Henry's side. She wasn't a passive bystander. She was an active participant. With her French education, she had been exposed to new, reformist religious ideas that were sweeping across Europe. She introduced Henry to these radical texts, works by thinkers like William Tyndale, who argued that the king, not the Pope, should be the head of the Church in his own land. She wasn't just fueling his desire, she was fueling his ambition. She showed him a way out of his dilemma. If the Pope would not give him what he wanted, perhaps he didn't need the Pope at all. The idea took root in Henry's mind, growing from a desperate solution to a revolutionary conviction. Anne was positioning herself not just as a future wife, but as a partner in a radical new vision for England. The court was split. Those loyal to Queen Catherine and the Old Faith saw Anne as a wicked seductress, a heretic leading the king and the country to ruin. They called her the Great Whore and whispered curses in the corridors. But others, those who favored religious reform and saw an opportunity to break free from Rome's control, rallied around her. Anne became the symbol of change, the living embodiment of a new era. The walk through the candlelit hall was no longer just a stroll, it was a procession. Every step she took was a step away from the old world and towards a new one. The shadows she cast were not just her own. They were the shadows of a future no one could yet predict. Anne Boleyn wasn't just a woman who caught a king's eye. She was a catalyst. Her intelligence, her ambition, and her refusal to follow the rules forced a king to question his faith, his alliances, and the very foundation of his power. She didn't just enter the scene, she rewrote the entire play. The stage was now set for the English Reformation, a dramatic turn that would sever England from Catholic Europe, create the Church of England, and change the course of history forever. The story of a king's love, or perhaps his obsession, and how it shattered a kingdom's faith, is often told with grand pronouncements and dramatic flair. But today, let's pull back the curtain on the noise and look at the quiet moments, the scratches of a quill on parchment, the hushed conversations that truly changed the world. We're talking about Henry VIII's break with the Church of Rome, a seismic event that began not with a roar, but with a desperate and ultimately fruitless plea. Imagine England in the early 1530s, a nation deeply rooted in the Catholic faith for nearly 1,000 years. The Pope in Rome wasn't just a distant spiritual leader. His authority was woven into the very fabric of English life, from the grandest cathedrals to the humblest parish churches. Kings were crowned with his blessing, laws were measured against his divine authority, and the path to heaven for every soul was believed to run through the sacraments of his church. To defy the Pope was to defy God himself. It was, quite simply, unthinkable. Yet, one man was thinking it. King Henry VIII. On the surface, Henry was the model Catholic monarch. He had even been awarded the title, Defender of the Faith, by the Pope for his writings against Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation. But beneath the veneer of piety, a storm was brewing in the king's heart. A storm with two epicenters, a desperate need for a male heir and an all-consuming passion for a woman named Anne Boleyn. Henry's marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had produced only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. For Henry, this was a disaster. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, and he believed a female ruler would plunge England back into the chaos of civil war. He saw his lack of a son as a sign of God's displeasure. He fixated on a passage from the book of Leviticus that said a man who marries his brother's widow will be childless. Catherine had been briefly married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before he died. Was this the source of his curse? This question, this gnawing doubt, became Henry's obsession. It was an obsession that conveniently coincided with his infatuation with Anne Boleyn. Anne was not like the other court ladies. She was intelligent, witty, and fiery, having spent years in the sophisticated French court. She refused to be Henry's mistress, a role her own sister had previously filled. She wanted to be queen, or nothing at all. And for Anne to be queen, Catherine had to be set aside. So began what was known as the king's great matter. Henry needed an annulment, a declaration from the Pope that his marriage to Catherine was never valid in the first place. He believed his case was strong. He had Scripture on his side, or so he thought, and surely the Pope would grant this favor to a loyal king. He dispatched his most trusted advisor, the powerful Cardinal Wolsey, to Rome to secure the annulment. But Rome was a complex web of politics. The Pope, Clement VII, was in an impossible position. He was, at that very moment, a virtual prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and Charles V was none other than Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Catherine was a respected and devout queen, and her family was the most powerful in Europe. To annul her marriage would be to declare her a fornicator and her daughter, Mary, a bastard. It would be a profound insult to Emperor Charles, a man the Pope could not afford to alienate. Years dragged on. Letters flew back and forth between England and Rome. Wolsey tried every diplomatic trick he knew, but the Pope stalled, delayed, and ultimately refused to give Henry what he wanted. The king's frustration mounted, turning to rage. He saw the Pope's refusal not as a matter of complex international politics, but as a personal betrayal. His once loyal advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, paid the price for this failure. Stripped of his power and wealth, he died on his way to face charges of treason. With Wolsey gone, a new circle of advisors rose to prominence, men with more radical ideas. Figures like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer saw an opportunity in the king's dilemma. They began to whisper new, revolutionary thoughts into Henry's ear. What if the Pope's authority wasn't absolute? What if an English king didn't need permission from Rome to rule his own kingdom and his own church? They pointed to the growing Protestant movements in Germany, where princes were breaking away from papal control. They argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate source of authority. These were dangerous, electrifying ideas. For Henry, they offered a solution to his problem. If he couldn't get what he wanted through the Pope, perhaps he could get it without him. The idea took root and grew into a plan. It was a quiet coup, executed not on a battlefield, but in the halls of Parliament. Between 1532 and 1534, a series of laws were passed that systematically dismantled the Pope's power in England. The first major blow was the Act in Restraint of Appeals. This law declared that England was an empire governed by one supreme head, the king. It made it illegal to appeal legal or spiritual decisions to any foreign power, namely the Pope. The path to Rome was officially closed. Now, with the legal groundwork laid, Henry could finally act. Thomas Cranmer, a man sympathetic to the king's cause, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious office in the land. In May 1533, Cranmer convened a court, and without any input from Rome, he officially declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. A few days later, he validated Henry's secret marriage to a now pregnant Anne Boleyn. On June 1st, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The final, decisive break came in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy. This landmark piece of legislation declared, unequivocally, that King Henry VIII was the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The break was complete. The Pope was no longer the head of the Church in England. The king was. To refuse to accept this was now treason, punishable by death. This was not a popular decision for many. The English people were, by and large, content with their faith. They didn't ask for this revolution. For centuries, their lives had been guided by the rhythms of the Catholic calendar, the comfort of its rituals, and the authority of the Pope. Now they were being told that everything they believed was subject to the will of their king. Resistance was met with brutal force. Great and principled men like Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor of England, and Bishop John Fisher were executed for refusing to swear the oath recognizing Henry's supremacy. They chose their conscience and their God over their king, and they paid with their lives. Their quiet, dignified defiance stands as a powerful testament to the turmoil of the times. But the most visible and violent consequence of the break was the dissolution of the monasteries. Starting in 1536, Thomas Cromwell orchestrated the closure of over 800 monasteries, priories, and convents across England, Wales, and Ireland. For centuries, these institutions had been centers of wealth, learning, and charity. They were also bastions of loyalty to the Pope. Henry and Cromwell saw them as a source of opposition and, more importantly, as a source of immense wealth. The king needed money to fund his government and his potential wars with Catholic Europe. The monasteries were a treasure trove waiting to be plundered. Their lands, buildings, gold, and silver were seized by the crown. Priceless libraries were destroyed. Beautiful works of art were melted down, and the social safety net that the monasteries provided for the poor and the sick was torn apart. Thousands of monks and nuns were turned out, left to fend for themselves. This act of cultural and religious vandalism sparked outrage, culminating in a massive uprising in the north of England known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of common people rose up, not to overthrow the king, but to beg him to reverse his policies, restore the monasteries, and return the nation to the Catholic faith. It was the most significant rebellion of Henry's reign. He promised to listen to their demands, offered pardons, and then, once the rebels had dispersed, he had the leaders rounded up and executed. And what of Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom all of this was done? Her triumph was short-lived. In September 1533, she gave birth, but not to the longed-for son. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was palpable. 2 more failed pregnancies followed. The king, who had turned his kingdom upside down to marry her, now began to believe that this marriage, too, was cursed. His eye started to wander once again, this time to a quiet, gentle lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. Anne's enemies at court, sensing the shift in the king's favor, moved in for the kill. In 1536, she was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were almost certainly false, a convenient excuse for Henry to rid himself of a wife who had failed to give him a son. Within weeks, she was tried, convicted, and beheaded on Tower Green. The woman who had sparked a religious revolution was gone. Just days after her execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. The story of the break with Rome is a tangled web of personal desire and political ambition. It began with the king's desperate search for a male heir and his passion for one woman. But it spiraled into something far larger. It was a revolution from the top down, a reshaping of a nation's identity that had profound and lasting consequences. The Church of England was born, not from a mass movement of popular religious fervor, but from the will of a single, powerful, and ruthless monarch. It's a reminder that history's greatest turning points are often driven by the most human of motives: love, fear, greed, and the unquenchable thirst for power. The quiet scratching of a quill, the hushed advice of a counselor, the private anxieties of a king, these were the small currents that merged to create a tidal wave, washing away 1,000 years of tradition and setting England on a new and uncertain course. In Henry's world, a daughter just wouldn't cut it. He saw the lack of a son as a sign of God's displeasure, and he was ready to do anything to fix it. Enter Anne Boleyn. She wasn't just another courtly lady. She was different. Educated in the sophisticated courts of Europe, Anne was witty, intelligent, and captivating. She had a fire in her eyes and a mind of her own. When she returned to the English court, she immediately caught the king's attention. But unlike many others, Anne refused to be just the king's mistress. She wanted to be his queen, or nothing at all. This bold stance only made Henry more obsessed. He was completely infatuated, writing her passionate love letters and promising her the world. To marry Anne, Henry had to get rid of his current wife, Catherine. And this is where things get really complicated. He needed an annulment from the Pope, arguing his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had been his brother's widow. But Catherine was a proud Spanish princess, the aunt of the most powerful ruler in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Pope was in a tough spot, and under immense pressure, he refused Henry's request. But Henry VIII was not a man who took no for an answer. Fueled by his desire for Anne and his need for an heir, he decided to take a step that no one saw coming. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he would simply break away from the Pope's authority altogether. This wasn't just a personal decision. It was an earthquake that shook the foundations of England. Henry, with the help of advisors like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This monumental act, known as the English Reformation, severed centuries of ties with Rome and put England on a new, uncertain path. With his newfound power, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was finally declared null and void. Catherine was cast aside, forced to live out her days in isolation, still defiantly calling herself the true Queen of England. And so, the path was clear for Anne. In a series of secret ceremonies, she and Henry were married. The lady-in-waiting, who had dared to say no, had finally won the ultimate prize. Anne became queen. The celebrations were grand, but beneath the music lingered worry, pressure, and the never-ending hope for a male heir. Her coronation was a lavish affair, a spectacle designed to show the world and the English people that she was their rightful queen. But many saw her as a usurper, the other woman who had displaced their beloved Queen Catherine. The public's loyalty was divided, and Anne felt the weight of their judgment. The pressure on her was immense. She had promised Henry a son, and she knew her position, and perhaps even her life, depended on it. The entire political and religious revolution had been orchestrated for this very purpose. Soon Anne was pregnant, and the court held its breath in anticipation. Everyone, especially Henry, was certain it would be a boy, the long-awaited prince who would secure the Tudor line. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter, a healthy, intelligent baby girl named Elizabeth. While we now know this baby would grow up to be one of England's greatest monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I, at the time, her birth was a bitter disappointment for Henry. Another daughter, he already had one, Mary, from his marriage to Catherine. The king's disappointment was palpable, and it cast a dark shadow over the early days of their marriage. Despite this setback, Anne and Henry's relationship continued for a while. There were moments of genuine affection and happiness. Anne was a patron of the arts and a supporter of religious reform. She was a vibrant and influential queen, but the ghost of the male heir haunted their marriage. Anne suffered a series of miscarriages, each one chipping away at Henry's patience and affection. His initial passion for her began to cool, replaced by frustration and resentment. He had turned his kingdom upside down for her, and she had failed to deliver on her promise. As Henry's love for Anne waned, her enemies at court grew bolder. They had always resented her influence and power, and now they saw their chance. Whispers and rumors began to circulate. Anne's sharp tongue and confident demeanor, once seen as charming, were now portrayed as arrogance and malice. The king, desperate for an escape route, and already with his eye on a new lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, was all too willing to listen to these accusations. The final act of this tragedy unfolded with shocking speed. Anne Boleyn was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were outrageous and almost certainly false, a convenient excuse for Henry to get rid of her. She was put on trial, a sham proceeding, where the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Betrayed by the man who had once written her love poems, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. In May 1536, less than 3 years after her glorious coronation, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. She faced her death with incredible courage and dignity, maintaining her innocence to the very end. Her execution sent shockwaves through the court and the country. The queen, for whom a king had broken with the church and defied the pope, was gone. Just days after her death, Henry married Jane Seymour, the woman he hoped would finally give him the son he so desperately craved. The story of Henry and Anne is a powerful reminder of how personal desires can have massive public consequences. Their love affair led to the English Reformation, changing the course of a nation's history forever. But for Anne, the dream of being queen turned into a nightmare. She flew too close to the sun, and the fall was devastating. In the spring of 1536, the vibrant court of King Henry VIII, once a stage for Anne Boleyn's triumph, became the setting for her tragic downfall. The air, thick with promise just a few years earlier, now crackled with suspicion and conspiracy. Anne, the queen who had defied popes and traditions, found herself increasingly isolated, a solitary figure in a court that had once adored her. The political winds had shifted, and they were no longer in her favor. Henry's desire for a male heir, the very reason he had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne, had become a consuming obsession. Anne had given him a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, a brilliant and healthy child. But after a series of heartbreaking miscarriages, Henry's patience wore thin. His infatuation, which had burned so brightly, began to cool, replaced by a chilling indifference. His eyes started to wander, and soon they settled on one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, the quiet and gentle Jane Seymour. Anne's enemies, who had been waiting in the shadows, saw their opportunity. Led by the shrewd and calculating Thomas Cromwell, they began to weave a web of accusations around the Queen. Cromwell, once Anne's ally in the Reformation, now saw her as an obstacle to his own political ambitions and a threat to the stability of the kingdom. He needed her gone, and he would stop at nothing to make it happen. The charges they concocted were shocking and baseless, designed to destroy her reputation completely. They accused her of adultery with multiple men, including members of the king's own privy chamber, and even the grotesque crime of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. These weren't just accusations of infidelity. They were accusations of high treason, a direct assault on the king and the succession. The men accused alongside her were quickly arrested, interrogated, and under immense pressure. Some were coerced into making false confessions. The speed of Anne's fall was breathtaking. On May 2nd, 1536, while watching a tennis match, she was arrested and taken by barge to the Tower of London. The very route she had taken in splendor for her coronation procession now led her to a cold stone cell. The irony was cruel and absolute. She entered the Tower not as a celebrated queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Inside the Tower, Anne maintained her innocence with courage and dignity. She wrote a final, desperate letter to Henry, pleading for her life and for the honor of her name. She reminded him of his love for her, of their daughter, and of her unwavering loyalty. "Try me, good king," she wrote, "but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and my judges." Her plea fell on deaf ears. Henry, convinced by Cromwell's fabricated evidence, or perhaps simply wanting to be free to marry Jane Seymour, refused to intervene. Her trial was a sham, a piece of political theater designed to produce only one outcome. The evidence against her was flimsy, based on rumor, hearsay, and coerced testimony. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the trial, his face a mask of grim duty as he sentenced his niece to death. Anne defended herself eloquently, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest. Even in her final days, Anne's spirit was not entirely broken. Those who saw her in the Tower reported that she fluctuated between moments of deep despair and periods of almost unnerving cheerfulness, perhaps a sign of the immense psychological strain she was under. She worried for her daughter, Elizabeth, and for the souls of the innocent men who would die because of her. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to a private scaffold on Tower Green to spare her the indignity of a common executioner's axe. Henry had arranged for an expert swordsman to be brought from France, dressed in a dark gray damask gown trimmed with ermine. She addressed the small crowd of onlookers. She did not protest her innocence, as this might have endangered her daughter. Instead, she offered a conventional speech, praying for the king and urging the people to judge her charitably. "I am come hither to die," she said calmly. "For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Her final words were a prayer to Jesus Christ. "I commend my soul." With one swift stroke of the sword, her life was ended. Anne Boleyn's story is a chilling reminder of the brutal nature of Tudor politics, where power was absolute and life was precarious. She was a woman of immense ambition, intelligence, and charm, who flew too close to the sun and was ultimately consumed by its fire. Her fall was as dramatic and swift as her rise, a silent, sorrowful end to a chapter that had reshaped a nation. The court that had once celebrated her name now fell silent, and the fear she had inspired was replaced by a somber quiet. Her legacy, however, would live on through her daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day take the throne and become one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's story, though ending in tragedy, was far from over. After the fiery passion of Anne Boleyn and the steadfast loyalty of Catherine of Aragon, Jane's arrival at court was like a calm after the storm. She wasn't known for dazzling wit or political maneuvering. Instead, her power lay in her quiet dignity and her unwavering composure. Imagine the Tudor court, a place of constant intrigue, ambition, and drama. In the middle of it all was Jane, often found sewing quietly in a warm, fire-lit room. Her presence, a source of tranquility in a turbulent world. Jane Seymour entered Henry's life like a whisper, soft, patient, and peaceful. She was known for her gentle nature, a stark contrast to her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. Where Anne was vivacious and challenging, Jane was demure and soothing. Contemporaries described her as the gentlest woman I ever knew, and it was this very quality that seemed to captivate the king. Henry, exhausted by years of religious turmoil and the dramatic downfall of his second wife, found solace in Jane's calm demeanor. He saw in her the promise of a peaceful domestic life, a haven from the pressures of his reign. Her motto was "bound to obey and serve," a phrase that perfectly encapsulated her approach to being queen. She didn't seek to rule alongside Henry, but rather to support him. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but a clever understanding of her role and the king's desires. Jane's influence was subtle but effective. She worked quietly behind the scenes to reconcile Henry with his eldest daughter, Mary, who had been cast aside during the break with Rome. It was a delicate and dangerous task, but Jane's gentle persistence eventually paid off, earning her Mary's lifelong gratitude. Jane's quiet nature also belied a steely resolve when it came to her faith. She was a devout Catholic and was deeply troubled by the dissolution of the monasteries. During the Pilgrimage of Grace, a major uprising in the north of England against Henry's religious reforms, Jane reportedly fell to her knees and begged the king to restore the abbeys. It was a brave move, one that could have easily cost her his favor or even her life. Henry sharply reminded her of Anne Boleyn's fate for meddling in his affairs. Yet, Jane's plea showed that beneath her placid exterior was a woman of deep conviction, willing to risk everything for what she believed in. The pinnacle of Jane's life and her ultimate tragedy came with the birth of her son. On October 12, 1537, after a long and difficult labor, Jane gave birth to Prince Edward. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and Henry finally had his male heir. His joy was immeasurable. He had the future of the Tudor dynasty secured, but But this triumph was short-lived. Just days after the glorious christening of the young prince, Jane fell gravely ill with a postpartum infection. The court that had so recently been filled with joyous celebration was now hushed with anxious whispers. Henry, who had just found his perfect queen and the mother of his son, was distraught. He stayed by her side, but the medical knowledge of the time was no match for the fever that consumed her. On October 24th, just 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour died. Henry VIII was utterly heartbroken. He had loved other wives, but his grief for Jane was profound and lasting. He ordered the entire court into mourning and arranged for her a magnificent queen's funeral. He commanded that he be buried next to her when his time came, a final testament to his affection. Of all his 6 wives, Jane was the only one to receive a queen's burial, and the only one he chose as his eternal companion. So why does Jane Seymour, the quiet queen, hold such a significant place in history? It wasn't just because she gave Henry his heir. It was because she offered him something he desperately needed: peace. In a life marked by chaos and conflict, Jane was his moment of calm. She was the model of a perfect Tudor, Queen pious, obedient, and fruitful. Her legacy is not one of dramatic political battles or intellectual debates, but of a quiet, steadying influence that, for a brief time, brought a measure of serenity to one of England's most tempestuous kings. She proved that sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that doesn't shout but whispers. Her story is a poignant reminder that strength comes in many forms. After 2 queens, countless prayers, and a kingdom holding its breath, the impossible finally happened. In the grand halls of Hampton Court Palace, on October 12, 1537, a cry echoed that would change the course of English history. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third and perhaps most beloved wife, had given birth to a son, a healthy, living, breathing boy, Prince Edward. For King Henry, this was more than just the birth of a child. It was divine validation. It was the culmination of a desperate 20-year struggle that had seen him break with the Catholic Church, declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and send 2 queens from his bed, one to a life of lonely exile, the other to the executioner's block. He had risked his immortal soul, fractured his kingdom, and alienated allies, all for this one moment. And now it was here. The Tudor dynasty was secure. Imagine the scene at Hampton Court. The news would have spread like wildfire, bells pealing across London, bonfires lit in every town and village. For the people of England, it was a moment of immense relief and celebration. An undisputed male heir meant stability. It meant no more fears of a succession crisis, no more threat of civil war looming on the horizon. The Te Deum was sung in churches across the realm. It was a national holiday, a collective sigh of relief. Henry was ecstatic, beside himself with joy. He had paraded his previous daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, but this was different. This was his son, his heir, the future King of England. He reportedly wept with joy, cradling the infant prince. He showered Jane with praise and affection, calling her his one true wife. In his eyes, she had fulfilled her ultimate duty and given him the one thing no one else could. He ordered a magnificent christening, a spectacle of Tudor pomp and circumstance. The baby prince was wrapped in robes of cloth gold, his procession lit by hundreds of torches. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were given places of honor, a symbolic uniting of the fractured royal family. But this triumphant joy was tragically short-lived. The splendor of the christening masked a growing anxiety within the palace walls. Childbirth in the 16th century was perilous, and the days following were a minefield of potential infection. Jane, who had endured a long and difficult labor, began to weaken. A fever took hold, what we would now recognize as puerperal fever, a common and often fatal postpartum infection. Despite the best efforts of the royal physicians, Jane's condition deteriorated rapidly. The joy of the court turned to hushed prayers and fearful whispers. Just 12 days after giving birth to the future king, Queen Jane Seymour died. Henry was devastated. He had found his perfect queen, the woman who had given him everything he ever wanted, only to lose her in his moment of greatest triumph. He plunged into a deep and profound grief, ordering the entire court into mourning. He commanded that he be buried next to her at Windsor Castle, a testament to his enduring love. Jane Seymour was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral, a final honor for the mother of his heir. The birth of Edward and the death of Jane marked a pivotal turning point in Henry's reign. He had his son, but at a terrible cost. The loss of Jane seemed to harden him, accelerating his descent into the tyrannical and paranoid figure we often remember. He would go on to marry 3 more times, but his quest for an heir was over. The future of his dynasty now rested on the fragile shoulders of one little boy, Prince Edward. Edward's childhood was unlike any other. He wasn't just a prince. He was the jewel of the realm, the most precious asset of the Tudor crown. He was raised in a protected, almost sterile environment, shielded from the common illnesses that claimed so many children. His household was meticulously managed, his every meal, every lesson, every moment planned and supervised. He was a bright and pious boy, educated by the finest reformist scholars of the day. He was groomed from birth to be a new kind of king, a Protestant king, for a new Protestant England. Yet the shadow of his father's actions and his mother's death loomed large. His existence had been bought at the price of religious schism and personal tragedy. As he grew, the pressures of his inheritance weighed heavily. The court was a viper's nest of political intrigue, with powerful men like his uncles, the Seymours, jockeying for influence over the young prince. They knew that whoever controlled Edward controlled the future of England. And so, the celebration of his birth gave way to a new kind of anxiety. The Tudor dynasty was secure, but for how long? The health of the young prince was a matter of constant national concern. Every cough, every fever, sent ripples of fear through the kingdom. Henry had his male heir, but the future was far from certain. The birth of Edward Tudor was not an end to the story, but the beginning of a new, dramatic, and ultimately tragic chapter in the saga of the Tudor dynasty. The boy who was meant to be the salvation of his house would find his own reign short and troubled. A final, ironic twist in Henry VIII's desperate quest for a son. The celebrations, however, were tragically short-lived. Jane, who had given Henry his greatest prize, succumbed to complications from childbirth just 12 days after Edward was born. Henry was devastated. He had always seen Jane as his one true, perfect wife, meek, obedient, and the mother of his heir. He ordered a magnificent funeral and commanded that he be buried next to her when his time came, a wish that was eventually fulfilled. For Henry, Jane Seymour would forever be enshrined in memory as his ideal queen. The court entered a period of quiet mourning. For 2 years, Henry remained a widower, perhaps grieving, perhaps simply weighing his options. But in the high-stakes world of Tudor politics, a king couldn't stay single for long. The need for international alliances was ever present, and marriage was the ultimate diplomatic tool. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a staunch advocate for Protestant reform, saw an opportunity. He began to push for a match that would secure England's position against the powerful Catholic alliance of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Cromwell's eyes turned toward Germany and the Protestant Duchy of Cleves. There, the Duke had 2 unmarried sisters, and one of them was This was a marriage born entirely of political necessity. Cromwell commissioned the famous court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to travel to Cleves and paint portraits of both Anne and her sister, Amalia. The instructions were clear: paint them as they truly were, without flattery. When Holbein returned with the portraits, Henry was reportedly pleased with Anne's likeness. He saw a demure and suitable-looking woman. Negotiations moved forward swiftly. For Henry and his council, it was a strategic move on the European chessboard. For Anne, it was a complete upheaval of her world. Anne of Cleves was raised in a small, sheltered, and deeply conservative German court. Her education was a far cry from the sophisticated humanist training that Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn had received. She couldn't speak English, French, or Latin, the languages of the English court. She hadn't been taught to sing, dance, or play an instrument, which were considered essential social skills for a queen consort in England. Her world was one of domesticity and piety. She was known for her skill in needlework, but that was hardly the stuff of sparkling, courtly conversation. Nevertheless, she was, by all accounts, a gentle, virtuous, and kind-hearted young woman. She dutifully agreed to the match and began the long, arduous journey to a foreign land to marry a king she had never met. The plan was for a grand, formal meeting upon her arrival in England. But Henry, ever the impatient and romantic showman, had other ideas. Hearing that his bride-to-be had landed and was resting at Rochester, he decided to surprise her. Disguised as a common messenger, he burst into her chambers, expecting to find the charming woman from Holbein's portrait. He hoped for a moment of movie-like romance, where she would see through his disguise and recognize the heart of her king. The reality was a disaster. Anne, startled and confused by this strange, burly man speaking a language she didn't understand, was understandably polite but utterly bewildered. She barely glanced at him before turning back to watch the bull baiting outside her window. Henry's ego was bruised, maybe even shattered. He left the room fuming, convinced he had been deceived. This disastrous first meeting set the tone for their entire relationship. Henry was instantly and completely put off. He famously and cruelly declared, "I like her not, I like her not." He complained to his counselors that she was nothing like her portrait, and his unflattering description of her as a Flanders mare has rather unfairly stuck through history. He desperately tried to find a way out of the marriage before it even happened. He grilled ambassadors, looked for loopholes in the marriage treaty, and pressured Cromwell to find an escape route. But the diplomatic agreements were ironclad. With the German delegation already in London and his own international reputation on the line, Henry had no choice but to go through with it. The wedding, on January 6, 1540, was a somber, joyless affair. Henry could barely bring himself to look at his new bride. The wedding night was an even greater failure. Henry later publicly claimed that he was unable to consummate the marriage, blaming Anne's appearance. He declared her no true maid, suggesting she was not a virgin, a serious and damaging accusation. Poor Anne, completely out of her depth, likely had no idea what was expected of her. Raised in a sheltered court, it's possible she didn't even understand what consummation entailed. She reportedly told her ladies-in-waiting that when the king came to bed, he kissed her, took her by the hand, and said good night, sweetheart, and in the morning, farewell, darling. For her, this was marriage. The unconsummated marriage gave Henry the legal loophole he had been searching for. It also sealed the fate of the man who had arranged it all, Thomas Cromwell. As Henry's infatuation with a new lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, grew, his desire to end his marriage to an intensified. Cromwell, having failed to secure a successful royal match and losing the king's favor, was arrested for treason and heresy. His fall was as swift and brutal as his rise had been. He was executed in July 1540, the very same day Henry married his fifth wife. But what about Anne is where her story takes a surprising and, frankly, brilliant turn. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who fought her divorce to the bitter end, or Anne Boleyn, who lost her head, Anne of Cleves played her cards perfectly. When approached about an annulment, she didn't fight, she didn't argue. She showed incredible political savvy and pragmatism. She meekly agreed to the king's demands, confirming that the marriage had never been consummated and accepting the annulment. Her cooperation was a massive relief to Henry. He was so grateful for her sensible and agreeable nature that he rewarded her handsomely. Instead of being sent back to Cleves in disgrace, Anne was given a generous settlement, including several grand properties like Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former home of the Boleyns. More importantly, she was given a new, unprecedented title, the king's beloved sister. This was a stroke of genius. It elevated her status, making her the most important woman in the kingdom after the new queen and Henry's daughters. She was a frequent and welcome guest at court, developing a warm, friendly relationship with Henry. They were often seen playing cards and exchanging gifts. She also formed a genuine bond with Henry's children, especially Elizabeth, and was a beloved figure in their lives. Anne of Cleves essentially won the Tudor survival lottery by choosing cooperation over confrontation. She turned a potentially disastrous situation into a life of freedom, wealth, and security. She outlived Henry, she outlived his other wives, and she died peacefully in England at the age of 41, respected and well-liked. Her story is a testament to her intelligence and adaptability. She came to England as a political pawn, was brutally rejected, but ultimately carved out a happy and independent life for herself. She wasn't Henry's most passionate love, but she was arguably his most successful ex-wife. While her reign as queen was one of the shortest, her life in England was long and, by all accounts, very comfortable. So, how did the Flanders mare, as she was unkindly nicknamed, manage to not only keep her head but thrive in the treacherous Tudor court? After the profound loss of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII remained a widower for 2 years. The court was in mourning, and the king himself was heartbroken. However, the political landscape of Europe waits for no man, not even a king. The need for a male heir was still a pressing concern, with only young Prince Edward to secure the Tudor succession. Beyond that, Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was deeply worried about England's diplomatic isolation. The break with the Catholic Church had left England vulnerable, surrounded by hostile Catholic powers like France and the Holy Roman Empire. Cromwell saw a solution in a strategic alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany. This is where Anne of Cleves enters the picture. She was the daughter of the Duke of Cleves, a powerful ruler of a small but strategically important territory in what is now modern-day Germany. An alliance with Cleves would be a significant step in building a Protestant coalition against the Catholic giants. For Cromwell, this marriage was the cornerstone of his foreign policy. He began to enthusiastically promote the match to the king, commissioning the famous court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to travel to Germany and paint portraits of Anne and her younger sister, Amalia. Henry, still grieving for Jane, was hesitant to remarry, but was swayed by the political logic and, crucially, by Holbein's flattering portrait of Anne. The painting depicted a demure and comely young woman. Based on this image and Cromwell's glowing reports, Henry agreed to the marriage. Negotiations moved swiftly, and a marriage treaty was signed in October 1539. Anne, who had been raised in a small, sheltered court and spoke only German, began her long journey to a new country, a new language, and a husband she had never met. She was about 24 years old, polite, kind, but utterly unprepared for the sophisticated and often ruthless English court. Her journey across wintry Europe was arduous. As her carriage rolled through the frozen fields, she was likely filled with a mix of apprehension and duty. She was a pawn in a great political game, her future tied to the whims of a powerful king known for his volatile temper. She arrived in England at the end of December 1539, ready to meet her future husband. And it's here, at their very first meeting, that the story takes a disastrous turn. Henry, eager to see his bride, decided to surprise her. Disguising himself and a few of his gentlemen, he burst into the room where Anne was watching a bull baiting from a window in Rochester. This kind of romantic, chivalrous gesture was common in courtly love traditions, but completely alien to Anne's sheltered German upbringing. She didn't recognize the disguised king, was startled by the intrusion of these boisterous strangers, and gave him a brief, confused glance before turning back to the window. Henry was mortified. He had expected his bride to see through his disguise with the eyes of love, to be charmed and delighted. Instead, he was met with indifference. To make matters worse, when he finally revealed his identity, he was convinced that her appearance in person did not live up to the beauty promised by Holbein's portrait. He felt deceived and declared privately, "I like her not. I like her not." From that moment, the marriage was doomed. Henry tried desperately to find a legal loophole to get out of the wedding. He pressured Cromwell, blaming him for the disastrous match. He complained that Anne was not as described, that she had no accomplishments like singing or playing an instrument, and that her manners were unrefined. But the diplomatic situation was too delicate. The alliance with Cleves was already in place, and backing out now would be a grave insult and a political catastrophe. With no other choice, a grim and reluctant Henry went through with the wedding on January 6, 1540. The wedding night was a failure. Henry later famously declared to his physicians that he was unable to consummate the marriage, claiming he found his new wife so unappealing that he could find no will to bed her. He even questioned if she was truly a virgin, a cruel accusation based on nothing more than his own disappointment. Anne, for her part, remained quiet and dignified. Naive about marital matters, she reportedly told her ladies-in-waiting that when the king came to bed, he would kiss her, take her by the hand, and say good night, sweetheart, and in the morning, farewell, darling. She seemed to believe this was all that was required of a wife. The political winds that had brought Anne to England soon shifted. The alliance between France and the Holy Roman Empire began to crumble, making the German Protestant alliance less critical for England's security. This gave Henry the opening he needed. With the political necessity gone, there was nothing holding him to a wife he so openly disliked. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the marriage, became the scapegoat. Accused of treason and heresy, partially for his role in this failed union, he was arrested and eventually executed in July 1540. It was a brutal end for one of Henry's most loyal and effective ministers. With Cromwell out of the way, the path was clear for an annulment. Anne was asked to confirm that the marriage had never been consummated and to agree to the separation. Here, Anne of Cleves showed her remarkable intelligence and pragmatism. She had seen what happened to Catherine of Aragon when she defied the king, and she was surely aware of the fate of Anne Boleyn. Rather than fighting a battle she could not win, she cooperated fully. She graciously accepted the king's decision, agreeing to the annulment on the grounds of non-consummation and a supposed pre-contract of marriage she had with another man. Her compliance and good nature completely changed Henry's attitude towards her. The king, who had once recoiled from her, was now filled with gratitude and relief. Instead of being sent back to Germany in disgrace, she was given a generous settlement. She received several grand properties, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn. She was also given a substantial income and, most importantly, an official title, the king's beloved sister. This was a stroke of genius. It gave her precedence over all other women in England except for the king's wife and daughters. She became a respected and independent noblewoman, free from the obligations of marriage and the dangers of the throne. And so began the second, much happier chapter of her life. Anne lived comfortably and contentedly in England for the rest of her days. She remained on friendly terms with Henry, who often invited her to court for festivities. She was a frequent and welcome guest, and it seems they developed a genuine, platonic affection for one another. She also formed good relationships with Henry's children, especially princesses Mary and Elizabeth. After Henry's death, she maintained her status as a wealthy and independent lady, respected by all. She outlived not only Henry, but also his entire succession of wives, dying peacefully in 1557 during the reign of her former stepdaughter, Queen Mary. Anne of Cleves's story is a powerful lesson in making the best of a bad situation. She arrived as a political pawn in a foreign land, was publicly rejected by her husband, and saw the man who arranged her marriage beheaded. Yet, through her calm demeanor, intelligence, and pragmatic acceptance of her circumstances, she turned a potential tragedy into a personal triumph. She chose cooperation over confrontation, securing for herself a life of freedom, wealth, and security that few Tudor women, let alone queens, ever enjoyed. Hers is not a story of passionate romance or tragic downfall, but one of quiet dignity and incredible survival. She played the game of thrones and won, not by fighting for the crown, but by gracefully stepping away from it. Have you ever heard of the girl who danced her way to the English throne, only to find it was a gilded cage? Before Catherine, the court of Henry VIII had grown old and somber. The king himself was ailing, burdened by weight, a festering leg wound, and the ghosts of his past. The mood was heavy, the halls quiet. Then, like a sudden burst of sunshine, Catherine arrived. She was barely a woman, perhaps only 19, vibrant and full of life. She wasn't a stoic political pawn or a pious matron. She was a girl who loved to laugh, to dance, to wear beautiful clothes. Her motto was no other will but his, a promise of devotion to the king, and for a while it seemed she was the perfect cure for his melancholy. Henry was utterly captivated. He showered her with gifts, jewels, estates, and the ultimate prize, the crown of England. He called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood. The court, once so grim, was suddenly filled with music and festivities again. Catherine, with her infectious energy, had seemingly turned back the clock, making the aging king feel young and vigorous once more. It was a fairy tale beginning, a dizzying ascent from minor nobility to the most powerful woman in the land. But in the Tudor court, fairy tales rarely have happy endings. The very youth that so enchanted the king was also Catherine's greatest vulnerability. She had been raised in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household, a place that was less of a prim and proper school for ladies and more of a chaotic, loosely supervised dormitory. It was there, long before she ever met the king, that Catherine's story became complicated. She had youthful flirtations, secret meetings, and relationships that were far from innocent. One was with her music teacher, Henry VIII, and another, more serious involvement, was with a gentleman named Francis Derham. These were the secrets of her past, ghosts waiting in the wings. When she came to court and caught the king's eye, these ghosts didn't just disappear. Instead, they followed her. Francis Derham, perhaps unwisely seeking to capitalize on his old connection, was given a position in Catherine's new royal household. It was a reckless move. The Tudor court was a viper's nest of ambition and jealousy. Every whisper was heard, every glance was noted. Having someone from her past so close was like carrying a lit torch into a gunpowder store. And it wasn't just Derham. At court, Catherine found herself surrounded by the flattering attention of handsome young courtiers. One, in particular, stood out, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, and a favorite of Henry himself. He was charming, bold, and dangerously close to the king. Soon, secret letters were being exchanged, and late-night meetings were arranged, aided by one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the infamous Lady Rochford, the same woman whose testimony had helped condemn her own husband and Anne Boleyn years earlier. Catherine was playing with fire. Whether her relationship with Culpeper was a full-blown affair or simply a reckless romantic flirtation, it was treason. To betray the king's bed was to challenge his authority, his honor, and the stability of the realm. The whispers that had started as quiet murmurs about her past now grew into a dangerous roar. People who knew of her history in the Duchess's household began to talk, their stories fueled by envy or a desire for favor. The net was slowly closing in. The beginning of the end came during a royal progress to the north of England. It was supposed to be a triumph, a display of royal power. But while Henry was busy with matters of state, Catherine was allegedly continuing her secret rendezvous with Culpeper. Back in London, however, the dam of silence was about to break. A man named John Lascelles, whose sister had served with Catherine in the Dowager Duchess's household, decided to report what he knew to the Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer. He told Cranmer everything about Catherine's past with Francis Derham and Henry VIII. Cranmer was horrified. He was in an impossible position. To conceal this information was treason. To reveal it could unleash the king's terrifying wrath. After agonizing over what to do, he chose to act. He couldn't bring himself to tell the king face to face. Instead, during Mass, he discreetly passed Henry a letter detailing the accusations. At first, Henry refused to believe it. This couldn't be true of his rose without a thorn. He was convinced it was a malicious lie, a plot by his enemies. He ordered an investigation, confident it would prove his young queen's innocence. But it did the exact opposite. The investigation was swift and brutal. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were arrested and interrogated. Under torture, or the threat of it, they confessed. Derham admitted to a pre-contract with Catherine, which in the eyes of the Church could invalidate her marriage to the king. Culpeper confessed to his secret meetings with the Queen. The love letters were found. The evidence was undeniable. When the full truth was laid before Henry, his adoration turned to furious betrayal. The chronicles say the great king wept openly, mourning not just the loss of his wife, but the shattering of his illusion. He raged against Catherine, the council, and the world that had deceived him. His jewel was tarnished beyond repair. Catherine's fall was as swift and dramatic as her rise. She was stripped of her title as queen and imprisoned at Sion Abbey. Terrified and hysterical, she was a world away from the vibrant girl who had danced in the firelight. When she was told of her fate, she was initially consumed by panic, but eventually she found a sense of calm, a weary resignation. On a cold February morning in 1542, Catherine Howard was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same grim fortress where her cousin Anne Boleyn had met her end. She was just 21 or 22 years old. Legend says that the night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it. The next day, on the scaffold, she spoke briefly, admitting her guilt and asking for prayers. With one swing of the axe, the music stopped. The rose without a thorn was no more. Catherine Howard's story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of the Tudor court, where a woman's value was tied to her virtue and her past could become a death sentence. Was she a victim of her own naivety, a foolish girl who didn't understand the deadly game she was playing? Or was she a casualty of a predatory court and an aging tyrant's ego? Perhaps she was all of these things. Her brief, bright reign serves as a heartbreaking postscript to the tumultuous life of Henry VIII, a final, bloody chapter in his quest for a perfect queen. The Tudor court, a place of power, passion, and political storms, had seen many queens come and go. But the last one, Catherine Parr, was different. She wasn't a pawn in a political game or a fleeting infatuation. She was a beacon of stability, a woman of profound wisdom and gentle strength, who brought a much-needed sense of peace to the turbulent final years of King Henry VIII's reign. Picture this: a quiet room in the palace, bathed in a warm, golden glow from the hearth. Books are stacked neatly, and at a sturdy wooden desk sits Queen Catherine. She's not adorned in extravagant jewels or stiff courtly attire. Instead, she's engrossed in a book, the soft turning of the pages, the only sound in the room. This was her power, not the power of seduction or lineage, but the power of the mind and the spirit. Catherine Parr was already a widow twice over when she married Henry. She was a mature, intelligent woman, deeply committed to her Protestant faith and learning. Unlike her predecessors, she entered the marriage not with youthful naivety, but with a clear understanding of the man she was marrying and the court she was entering. She knew the risks. She had seen what happened to those who displeased the king. Yet, she stepped into the role with grace and a quiet determination. Her primary mission, it seemed, was to heal. She took on the role of a peacemaker in the fractured royal family. Henry's relationship with his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had been strained for years. He had declared them illegitimate, casting them out of the line of succession. Catherine saw the pain this caused, not just for the girls, but for the king himself. With gentle persuasion and careful diplomacy, she worked to mend these broken bonds. She encouraged Henry to spend time with his children, to see them not as political liabilities, but as his own flesh and blood. It was largely thanks to Catherine's influence that both Mary and Elizabeth were eventually restored to the line of succession. She fostered a genuine family atmosphere, something the royal children had rarely experienced. She personally oversaw their education, ensuring that Prince Edward, the future king, and his sisters received the best tutoring available. She treated them all with kindness and affection, becoming a true stepmother figure who guided them with a steady hand. The court itself was a viper's nest of competing factions, particularly between religious reformers and conservatives. Catherine, a known supporter of the Protestant Reformation, had to navigate these dangerous waters with extreme care. Her enemies, particularly the conservative faction led by Bishop Gardiner, saw her influence over the king as a threat. They watched her every move, waiting for an opportunity to bring her down, and that opportunity came. They accused her of heresy, a charge that could easily lead to the executioner's block. They even managed to get the king to sign a warrant for her arrest. It was a moment of extreme peril. Catherine learned of the plot against her and knew that a direct confrontation would be disastrous. Instead, she used her wisdom. She went to Henry, not to argue about theology, but to submit to his wisdom. She explained that she only debated religion with him to distract him from his ailments and to learn from his great knowledge. This display of humility and clever flattery worked. Henry was charmed, his ego soothed. He reconciled with her, and when the guards arrived to arrest the queen, the king furiously sent them away. Catherine had outmaneuvered her enemies and secured her position, not through force, but through intelligence and an astute understanding of her husband's psychology. Now, let's turn our gaze to the king himself. The once vibrant, athletic monarch who had dazzled Europe with his charisma and strength was now a shadow of his former self. In his final years, Henry VIII was a man weighed down by the immense burden of his reign. The firelight in his chambers would flicker across the tapestries, illuminating a figure that was slower, quieter, and deeply reflective. The boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a weary solemnity. Imagine the aging king, sitting alone, the constant pain from his jousting injury, a festering ulcer on his leg, was a daily torment. He was massively overweight, making it difficult to even move. The physical decay was a stark mirror to the political and personal turmoil that had defined his life. 6 marriages, a break with the Roman Catholic Church, the execution of friends, advisors, and 2 of his own wives. These were the heavy memories that filled his quiet moments. Did he feel regret? Did he question the choices that had reshaped a nation but had brought him so much personal strife? We can only speculate, but it's hard to imagine he didn't. The political storms he had weathered for decades had taken their toll. The alliances forged and broken, the constant threat of war. The religious upheaval he had unleashed, it was a legacy of monumental change, but also of chaos and bloodshed. He had consolidated power like few English kings before him, centralizing the state and creating the Church of England with himself at its head. He had secured the Tudor dynasty with a male heir, the obsession that drove so many of his drastic actions. But at what cost? In these final years, He relied more and more on the calming presence of Catherine Parr. She was his nurse, his companion, and his confidant. She would read to him, engage him in conversation, and manage the royal household with a serene competence that soothed his troubled spirit. She was the anchor in the storm of his declining health and his turbulent thoughts. As he grew more pensive, his thoughts likely turned to his legacy and the future of the kingdom. He had his heir, Edward, but he was still just a boy. The Regency Council he appointed to rule after his death was a careful construction of competing interests, a final political maneuver to ensure a stable transition of power. He was a king to the very end, always planning, always strategizing, even as his own body failed him. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, he left behind a transformed England. He was a monarch of immense contradictions, a lover of music and theology who could be ruthlessly cruel, a charismatic leader who was plagued by paranoia, a king who sought stability but created revolution. His final years, marked by physical suffering and quiet reflection, were the final chapter in one of the most dramatic and consequential lives in history. And at his side, providing comfort and peace, was his last queen, Catherine Parr, the survivor, the peacemaker, the steady hand that guided the king and his kingdom toward their final rest. And so, our long journey through the corridors of time comes to a gentle close. We've walked alongside a king and the 6 women who stood by his side, each leaving an indelible mark on the pages of history. The story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, often told with drama and turmoil, now settles into a quiet echo, a soft whisper carried on the breeze through the ancient stones of Hampton Court and Windsor Castle. It's a tale that has been told and retold, a grand play of power, love, and destiny. But tonight, we let the dust of centuries settle, smoothing the sharp edges of the past into a peaceful, flowing narrative. Imagine the grand halls, now empty and silent, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The vibrant tapestries, once witnesses to royal courts and whispered secrets, now hang in quiet contemplation. The portraits on the walls gaze out with serene expressions, their stories no longer sources of strife, but of reflection. This is where we find our peace, in the quiet aftermath of a story lived so long ago. The legacy of these 6 remarkable women is not just one of tragedy or triumph, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of courage, resilience, and humanity. Let's begin with Catherine of Aragon, the steadfast queen, the Spanish princess whose loyalty and piety defined an era. For over 20 years, she was Henry's queen, a partner in politics, and a mother to their daughter, Mary. Her story is often framed by its sorrowful end, her steadfast refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage. But if we look closer, we see a woman of immense strength and dignity. Her legacy is one of unwavering principle. She fought not for power, but for her faith, her marriage, and the rights of her child. Her influence extended far beyond the court. She was a patron of learning and a beloved figure among the people. As we drift into slumber, let's remember her not for her struggle, but for her unshakable resolve, a quiet strength that resonates through the ages. Her story fades into a gentle lesson of integrity, a peaceful thought to hold as we close our eyes. Then comes Anne Boleyn, a name that conjures images of ambition and revolution. Her arrival at court was like a spark in the night, igniting a chain of events that would forever change the course of England. She was captivating, intelligent, and fiercely determined. It was for her that Henry broke with the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England and setting in motion the English Reformation. Her reign as queen was brief and tumultuous, ending in a tragedy that has fascinated historians for centuries. But her legacy is monumental. Through her daughter, Elizabeth I, her vision for a Protestant England was realized, leading to a golden age of culture and exploration. Tonight, let's quiet the drama of her rise and fall. Instead, let's see her as a catalyst for change, a woman whose influence rippled far beyond her own lifetime. Her story becomes a whisper of transformation, a gentle reminder that even the most turbulent storms can lead to new horizons. After the storm came the calm, in the form of Jane Seymour, often remembered as Henry's one true love. She was the queen who finally gave him the male heir he so desperately craved, Prince Edward. Jane was gentle, quiet, and kind, a soothing presence in the wake of Anne Boleyn's dramatic reign. She worked to reconcile Henry with his eldest daughter, Mary, bringing a sense of peace and unity to the fractured royal family. Her time as queen was tragically short, as she passed away from complications following childbirth. Henry mourned her deeply, and it was beside her that he chose to be buried. Her legacy is one of peace and reconciliation. She represents a moment of quiet happiness in Henry's life, a brief but cherished period of domestic contentment. As we settle into rest, let her story be a soft lullaby, a tale of gentle love and the quiet joy of a dream fulfilled. Next, we journey across the sea to meet Anne of Cleves, the Flanders mare. Her story is often told as a royal mishmash, a political alliance gone wrong from the moment Henry first laid eyes on her. Their marriage was annulled after only 6 months, a potential disaster for the German princess. Yet, Anne of Cleves navigated the treacherous waters of the Tudor court with remarkable skill and grace. Instead of facing exile or a worse fate, she cleverly agreed to the annulment and accepted the title of the king's beloved sister. She lived out her days in England in comfort and wealth, enjoying a level of freedom and independence that was rare for women of her time. Her legacy is a surprising one. It's a story of pragmatism and survival. She turned a potential catastrophe into a life of peace and security. Her tale is a soothing reminder that sometimes the wisest path is one of adaptation and grace, a comforting thought as we drift deeper into tranquility. Then, the vivacious and youthful Catherine Howard enters the scene. A cousin of Anne Boleyn, she was a breath of fresh air at court, her high spirits and beauty captivating the aging king. Henry was utterly besotted with his rose without a thorn, showering her with gifts and affection. But her youth and past caught up with her. Accusations of infidelity, rooted in relationships from before her marriage to the king, led to her swift and tragic downfall. Her story is a heartbreaking one, a tale of a young girl thrust into a world she was not prepared for. But in her legacy, we can find a gentle note of caution, a quiet whisper about the vulnerabilities of youth and the unforgiving nature of power. Let's not dwell on the tragedy, but see it as a soft, somber melody in our historical symphony, a reminder to be kind, now fading gently into the quiet of the night. Finally, we meet Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife, the survivor. A mature and intelligent widow, she was more of a companion and nursemaid to the ailing Henry than a romantic partner. She was a kind stepmother to Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and played a crucial role in their education and upbringing, helping to unite the fractured family. A devout Protestant and a published author, she was a woman of deep faith and intellect who navigated the religious intrigues of the court with great care. She outlived Henry, marrying for a fourth time after his death. Her legacy is one of stability, wisdom, and survival. She brought a sense of calm and order to the final years of Henry's reign, closing a tumultuous chapter with grace and intelligence. Her story is the final, reassuring chord of our tale, a peaceful resolution that allows us to drift off, knowing that all is well and the story is complete. And so, the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives becomes a gentle echo in time. 6 lives, 6 stories, 6 chapters of companionship, hope, politics, and change. No longer a saga of beheadings and betrayals, but a collection of human experiences. We see the devotion of Catherine of Aragon, the ambition of Anne Boleyn, the gentleness of Jane Seymour, the pragmatism of Anne of Cleves, the tragedy of Catherine Howard, and the wisdom of Catherine Parr. Each played her part, each left her mark, and each contributed to the rich, complex history of a nation. A long tale, now softened into bedtime history, its sharp edges worn smooth by the passing of centuries. The grand castles now stand as silent monuments, the portraits gaze down with peaceful eyes, and the stories have become whispers on the wind. It's a history perfect for drifting into sleep, a gentle journey into the past that now leads us to a quiet and restful present. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful exploration. I hope these stories bring you calm and tranquility. Follow for more gentle journeys into history. Sleep well.